Hello, I'm Lydia and you're listening to Lens from the Fens. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode with me, Lydia. So before I get started with today's episode, I just wanted to do a little correction side piece from my last episode where I talked about some of the birds that I saw when I'm going out on different photo trips and mammal trips. It wasn't a great grey shrike that I saw, it was actually a lesser grey shrike, which is actually one of the rarer species that we get within the UK. So thank you to my birding friends who helped clarify that with me. And with that, I will get on with today's episode. So as I mentioned in my last episode as well, I promised that I would do a episode where I went over some of the familiar bird calls that I heard within the fens and that I hear pretty much all the time. So I've got a little list together of a mixture of the most common bird calls that I hear, some of the other regulars that are quite close to home that I recognise the call of, and also some of the seasonal and the rarer bird calls, again, that I get either within the fens or other parts of the UK. So just before I get into that, I wanted to provide a little bit of birding news. I have recently been following the release of the white-tailed eagles from the Isle of Wight. This is in support of the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation, where they've been really successful in releasing a few white-tailed eagles that have been going around the UK, mostly the southern part. So it was last April, on the 16th of April, one of the individuals flew from Needham Market near Suffolk all over to Bury St Edmunds, over the Ouse washes before returning to the Nen washes, and it stayed there overnight, roosted overnight, and then the next day on the 17th it actually went west across Peterborough before settling in the Castor Hanglands. So it did actually pass over near where I live. Unfortunately, I only heard about it a couple of hours after it was reported or when it was sighted, so it's a bit of a shame that I couldn't see it myself, but it is really good that these birds are now soaring over the skies over most of the UK. So as I promised, I am going to go through a few bird calls. I'll begin with the most common bird calls, most of which I get in my garden or near my workspace. What I'll do is I'll do it as a little bit of a game with you. So I will play the clips for you, and you can have the option to pause this episode if you want to have a bit more time to think about what the bird call would be, or repeat it a couple of times. And then once I've gone through those, I will then reveal the answers to you, and you can find out whether you got them right. So I will play the first 4 bird calls for you now. There'll be a little break in between, just so you can differentiate when the new bird call is being made. So I shall play them now, and now you can have the option to pause after each call to have a think or repeat them, and you can either write them down if you want, or you can just keep them in your head. So good luck. The first 4 calls are as so. Okay, I hope you've had the time to listen through the calls. I am now going to provide the answers to those calls. So the first one was, I think, quite an easy one. It is the common blackbird. So they're found throughout Britain and Ireland, although the densities are not as much as on moors and uplands, and they are not found in the highest mountains. So unlikely to find them within the highlands. They breed throughout Europe and parts of Russia, although there's other different races that occur in southern Europe, North Africa and Asia. The second call following that is the collared dove. So in terms of its habitat, they are pretty much associated with human activity. So there's a lot of them on the farmlands, which do surround my house and my street. And they're also pretty much common in all gardens where they have a bird table and access to food. Many live in towns where there is a varied habitat, gardens, parks, churchyards, but they do tend to avoid city centres. And although they're pretty much widespread across Britain and Ireland, they do tend to avoid the uplands, and especially in the moorlands and mountainous areas. So the third one was a pheasant. They are very much abundant on the fields at the back, and we actually had one or two come into our garden, which was quite a nice sight to see in the morning. So they're mostly at home on the ground, but they actually often roost within trees or bushes at night. If they do become disturbed, they either run from danger or they sit pretty tight before they suddenly burst out of cover, where they beat their wings quite rapidly. And the last call from that segment was a wood pigeon. They are mostly seen as a bit of a pest, but I actually think they, in terms of their appearance, once you get up quite close to them, they're actually quite nice to look at. So the adults consist of a blue-grey with a white crescent on the wing and a black band on the tail with a white patch around the neck. And it's on the neck where they have a green and purple sheen and quite a pinkish breast as well. So once you actually get quite up close to the wood pigeons, you can actually see the fluorescence of the wings around the neck. So they're actually quite nice to look at. So I'm going to play another 4 bird calls for you. These are slightly smaller birds, and again, most of them are going to be rather common, I assume, with where most of you, where they have a garden or you see them in the park. So again, I shall play these 4 and I shall reveal the answers afterwards. So again, that was another 4 bird calls of birds that are very common pretty much in all parts of the UK. The first bird call was that of the European robin. In my opinion, they are quite an inquisitive bird species. I've seen quite a few videos where people have held out their hand with a palmful of seed, and robins are probably one of the most frequent birds to feed right out of your hand. So they're pretty much in all gardens and abundant all over Britain and Ireland. And from the last recordings of their population, there are an estimated 6.7 million pairs within the UK and over 1 million in Ireland. So at the moment, the population appears largely stable. And the next one following that, again, probably quite another easy bird call for you, is the house sparrow. So these are a very social species of bird, often nesting in colonies and feeding in flocks throughout the year. So in the winter, the flocks may be large and they often form very noisy evening roosts, which I do get in my back garden at the minute. The third call that was played was the starling. At the minute, I have been spotting a lot of fledglings coming out towards the feeders at the minute. They are best recognised in comparison to their parents as being quite drab. It hasn't developed any of the fluorescent feathers yet or the bright white spots on its chest. It's very drab, it's very brown, but you can tell it's still a juvenile of the starling, purely because of its body shape and its beak. And they've been constantly pestering their parents for food, even though they watch their parents go and collect seed or food off the ground for them. So they would have been quite early fledglings, like just starting to learn how to get their own food, but they still call their mum or dad to keep feeding them. It's also outside of their breeding season where large groups of starlings feed together and form large roosts in the evening, and that's where lots of us get to experience the huge starling murmurations that happen pretty much all over the UK. But they perform amazing aerial manoeuvres just before they go to roost. It's not quite known why they do this. I mean, a lot of the time it would be to distract a potential predator that's around, to disorientate them, and as far as things go, you're a lot safer in numbers. But some of the, especially on, I think it's on Brighton Pier, where they've been just stunning videos of all of these starlings flocking together and all flying in amazing patterns in the sky. It's definitely a spectacle that I would fully recommend going to watch. It's just an amazing experience to see, and even when you get quite up close to the starlings like I have in my garden and seeing all the fluorescent colours on it, and obviously their sound is quite unique as well. So yeah, they're just a lovely bird that I'm grateful to see nearly all year round. And finally, the last call was that of a goldfinch. These are probably my most favourite of the smaller species of bird in terms of their identification. So when adults grow up from a juvenile, they in time develop their black and yellow bands across their wings, along with the white dots that go down each wing, and then obviously the face, which is a very bright red face surrounding the eyes and around the beak, and then going back with a white side and neck, and then finishing off with the black cap over the top. So they're a very, very handsome looking bird. So those were some of the most common bird calls that I get where I live and near places of work. So I'm going to go a little bit tougher, I say about medium level. Again, quite a lot of you will be familiar with these bird calls if you are an avid bird lover as I am. But for those who are either just listening to the podcast and thinking, oh, I'm not particularly good with all these bird calls, or I'm just starting out in IDing birds, then this will be a good time for you to brush up on those and to learn to identify different bird calls, and not by just identifying them when you see them fly or sitting in trees. So the next selection, again, I shall play them one after the other and reveal the answers at the end. So these are another 4 bird calls coming up. Again, I wish you all the best, and if you do want to pause at any time or repeat the bird calls again, then by all means you're allowed to do so. Here we go. So those were another 4 bird calls for you. A little bit tougher this time, but let's see how you did. So the first bird call was that of a green woodpecker. I have heard them in the past before properly identifying them. It's a very loud and quite distinctive call that they have. And the call of the green woodpecker is often given from a regular song post near a nest when they breed. So I have heard this call in a little wooded area just out the back of my house across the field. So it's quite likely, or more than likely, that there are at least one pair of green woodpeckers breeding near my house. So the next one can be pretty easy to identify by the name of the bird, which is a chiff-chaff. So the call that they make, the choo 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 choo, that can actually relate to obviously the name of the bird. In terms of their appearance, they are quite drab. The males are pretty much the same colour as the females, with a slight white line going just above the eyelid. So it's definitely the call that you'll have to identify them by before seeing the bird. And they can often be quite hard to pick out within the trees and bushes as well. So once you hear the call, then you definitely know that there is a chiff-chaff nearby. The third call is that of a great tit. I'm very lucky to have been able to sight them in the recent months, and it is their bird call that actually helped me identify that they're actually living in the trees that line my street. So quite early, most mornings, it is that call that I hear that often wakes me up. So this is the largest member of the tit family. They sport a black cap, collar and throat, with a black line running down the yellow breast and tummy. They have big white patches on each cheek. The back is quite a greenish colour, and then down to the wings they are mostly a blue-grey with a single white wing bar. And finally, the last one from that segment is the lapwing, or a peewit. So the same as the chiff-chaff, it is the call of a lapwing that can help you identify the bird. So as you heard in the clip, it is a pronounced peewit. Again, that's what they are mostly referred to around the farmland areas in particular. So these birds can be pretty territorial, especially when it comes to looking after their eggs on the nest. They tend to nest on farmland. So even if there's a bird, either just a smaller bird, a corvid, or a buzzard that's soaring quite high above, at least one of the adults would fly up and they would just constantly harass the bigger birds, driving them away from their nest, which I've seen happen multiple times when travelling along the back roads. Again, they're quite an intriguing bird to look at. Their wings are pretty much fluorescent, especially when you look at them in sunlight, and they sport the feathers that come out from the top of the head, which get longer over time as they turn into an adult. And these can be sighted pretty much across majority of Britain and Ireland, bar the Highlands and other mountainous areas. Okay, so I've got one more segment to play through for you. These are mostly seasonal calls, so for birds that travel here in the summer or in the winter, those are the only times that you can properly hear them. And also a couple of calls that I have managed to hear myself, and those can be interpreted as being quite rare calls nowadays. Again, I have another 4 bird calls for you, ranging from the seasonal to the rarer bird species that we get within the UK. So I wish you good luck once more, and here are the bird calls. Okay, so those are the last 4 calls. Again, a little bit harder probably for most people who are not familiar with identifying bird calls, but I shall go through the answers now. If you have got all or most of them right so far, then well done. So the first call was that of a cuckoo. Unfortunately, there has been a big decline in these quite intriguing birds. Again, last report suggested there are around 16,000 pairs in the UK and 6,000 in parts of Ireland. So as a whole, the population has declined by about 60% within England and Wales. But in recent years, it has increased numbers in Scotland. But I've been very fortunate to have heard cuckoos call. Actually, the last couple of days at my place of work, there's a riverbank that I have been to on my lunch break, and it was on the day before. I walked over there, and as soon as I got near the riverbank, I heard a cuckoo calling, which was really nice to hear, especially with their decline in numbers. It's quite sad to think that a lot of the younger generations will probably never hear a cuckoo calling, or those who in their younger days they would hear them on a regular basis and just see a dramatic decline in them. So they're a very notable bird, in my opinion. When it comes to breeding, they will actually take over nests of other birds and lay their eggs in those, so they won't actually be quite a loving parent. So the host bird will actually think that it's their own chick, and over time it will just keep feeding and feeding the young cuckoo, and unfortunately it will potentially kick out the other chicks or the eggs that are in the host nest. So it's a bit of a brutal way of them being brought up, but they're quite an intriguing bird, and I've come to appreciate them a lot more in the recent months. So the second bird call is of a winter visitor, which is the fieldfare. So most birds arrive to Britain and Ireland in October and early November, and more arrive during the midwinter, and they usually leave between March and May time. So the flocks are nomadic in terms of their search for food, and they may fly further south if food is in short supply, or if there has been a severe winter weather. So again, around here they have been very abundant when it comes to the winter time when they flock here, and they're quite a social bird. So at dusk within the winter, a large roost would gather within thick hedges and other types of dense cover. So it's a multitude that will call at once. So they can be, again, they're quite loud when it comes to when they roost in the evenings. So the third bird call, a summer visitor, which I think a lot of people will be familiar with, is the swallow. I do quite like their calls that they make. If you notice, there is a little bit of a flatulent sound that comes from them. At the minute they fly around my house, or they have been in the last week or so. And in terms of their appearance, they have a very curved tail, which is forked at either end. Their face is that of a reddish brown and has a blue and black chest band on the front. And they have a predominantly white stomach as well, so when they are flying, you can easily pick out their white chest, the forked tail, and also the white bars that go just a bit further up the tail towards the body. So for the last bird call, I would be surprised if you didn't actually identify this call first time around. It is that of a nightjar. I was very happy to have seen them for myself when I travelled to Norfolk last year. It was around dusk time that we were in an open woodland area with the heath in front, and it is around the time of dusk where the males would produce this call, and it's an enchanting call, I must say. They obviously have the churring noise that can rise and fall. That is mostly dependent on the way the bird turns its head around. And the slapping sound that you heard towards the end of the clip is actually it's clapping its wings above their head, which is part of the display that they do towards dusk time. So their appearance can look quite drab, but it is purely for camouflage. So they will roost in the trees during the daytime, and they will actually lay along the length of a thick tree branch, with its head slightly raised and its eyes closed. So if you were to pass an area of open woodland and there would be one nesting or roosting, you wouldn't actually see it at all. They are just so well camouflaged. I could only just see one myself, with the minimal amount of daylight that I had when I travelled there. So again, like the cuckoo, they suffered a big decline in numbers, estimation around 4,600 males in Britain in the summertime. There have been signs of a slight recovery in some areas in the last few years, and that is purely down to the dedication of different bird charities and organisations. So they are, again, quite a rare bird to identify and to hear. But hopefully in the coming decades we will be able to see a rise in numbers when they visit the UK in the summer. So I hope you enjoyed taking part in this little quiz of bird calls. Again, I could go through so much more for the bird calls that I hear regularly in my place of work, at home, and different reserves that I travel to for my photography. But there are plenty of resources that you can go to identify more birds in terms of the way they look or their bird calls in general. So I actually use an app called UK Bird Sounds, and it's very easy to use. I often use it whether there's a bird that I can't identify straight away. I would often go on there and the bird call would be there to hand. And along with the bird sounds, there's actually different lists. So there's a bird watching checklist, so you can tick off any bird that you've seen while you've been out and about. Or you can even have your own personal list. So if you've travelled somewhere and you identified a different array of birds, then you can do that. And there's even little quizzes on there as well. So there's a guess the picture, and there's a guess the sound, and guess the name. So it will show 5 or around 5 images of birds and the name of a bird, and you'll just simply click on the image that relates to that bird name, which is quite good. It's quite interactive, but most of the time I will just use it just to go through the library of bird sounds that they have, and more than often it would help me identify the bird there and then. So the RSPB, their website, is really good for again identifying birds, where you can find them, and little snippets of bird calls as well. And currently they're during the lockdown that we've all been part of, there is the Facebook group titled the Self-Isolating Bird Club, which has been set up by Chris Packham. And there it's just a really nice community where people can post birds that they've seen in their home, or when they've gone to local parks for exercise. So that's really good to share different tales, the birds you've seen, and they can also post other wildlife as well, different mammals that people get in their gardens. And finally, there is the British Trust for Ornithology. So they have masses and masses of resources on their website. They would often do different courses you could take part in, specific to the area of birds that you want to look at. Links to different books that you can find, you can read about. It's just a whole host of all types of information to do with birds. So you can have a look at those if you want to. A way you can identify birds in your own time, if you don't want to go looking online or searching for books all at once, you can take part in listening for the dawn chorus. So this is normally hosted the first Sunday of May, but you can do it any day before or after that pretty much. So the best time to listen would be around 4 a.m, which is where most birds would be up and they'd be singing. So it could be quite difficult at first, but over time you can able to identify all the individual bird calls, and yeah, you can just use the resources that you have to hand, whether it be through an app or whether it be using a bird book. So it's definitely something you can learn over time. You don't have to identify all in one go. you can just pick out the easiest ones, and then you can filter them out and then listen to the slightly quieter bird calls over time. And yeah, it's just a really good thing to take part in. So in light of the easing of some restrictions within the UK, I actually managed to take my first trip out in quite a few weeks with my camera last week. So the place I went to was literally on the back roads towards the River Welland. I parked up on the side of the road, and within minutes I saw a roe buck cross the road and into the field opposite me. I felt so elated, and it was just a wonderful sight to see after being obviously restricted to being at home pretty much all the time, apart from going into work. So I then travelled up to the main part of the riverbank, and I saw swallows. There was house martins that were drinking on the wing, which was really nice to see. A marsh harrier was hunting, and there was actually a lapwing defending its nest nearby, so it was swooping down at the harrier, and eventually the marsh harrier left the area. And then on the river itself, there were great-crested grebes, there were mallards, and one bird that I caught last minute as I was making my way back was a yellow wagtail, which was feeding within the farmer's fields. So it was just a really nice occasion to be able to go out, even if it's just a mile from home, and obviously keeping to the guidelines of social distancing. Over time, it would be nice to go back to the other local reserves, little bit further afield, but it's always really nice to see the wildlife that's closest to home. So that pretty much rounds things off for this episode. Just a quick thing, if you wanted to send in a question for me in terms of my association with wildlife or my photography, or if you have a wildlife story of your own, if you do photography yourself or you just enjoy seeing the nature in your garden or a local park, then you can actually email me at lensfromthefens@gmail.com. You can visit my website where I have my own podcast page, and there's a contact form at the bottom of that. So that is visiting pinfold-photographic.co.uk. Or otherwise you can direct message me through my Facebook and Instagram page. Again, just simply search for Pinfold Photographic, and you can just send me anything. It can be a question, it can be an encounter that you've experienced, whether recently or when you were younger. So yeah, I would love to hear from you. Again, my email address is lensfromthefens@gmail.com, or you can visit my Pinfold Photographic Facebook, Instagram and website page. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you all are well and stay safe, and I will speak to you again next week. My podcast cover shows my own image created using Canva. The theme music is provided by Purple Planet Music. Check out their royalty-free music at purple-planet.com.